Last time we added a few functionalities to our bot, such as context storage, context reset, and passing a system message. My name is Janek, and in this video we will expand our bot by adding a visual dialog for some of the basic LLM configurations. We will be using a Discord / command to send a modal to the user that will allow us to change the max token settings as well as the system prompt for a specific channel. Let's start out by planning the feature list that we need to implement. For our bot config, we want to be able to load it from memory. If not present in memory, then load it from file. If the file doesn't exist, then we want to create a default config. We want to save the config file. And as for the config options, we want to be able to set the chat max tokens, completions max tokens, system prompt message. For the visual presentation, we want to be able to edit any of the fields. We want to be able to verify that the user has access to modify it, notify the users that the config was updated, and notify the users in the channel that the system prompt changed, which will require the reset of context. Before we move on to the terminal to start implementing this, I want to do a bit of housekeeping first. First of all, players, a big thank you to everyone that left a comment or sent me a message. I enjoy reading all of them. If you find those videos useful or have ideas of what I could cover in the future, definitely leave me a comment. Second thing, recently Llama CPP project updated their file format for the models from GGML to GGUF. This means that the instructions I gave in previous videos about installing the Llama CPP Python will now not work verbatim with the latest version. I posted a pinned comment to all the videos where we use the GGML models to explain how to either install the older version, which still supports the GGML model, or to download the newer GGUF models. Last version of Llama CPP Python that still uses the old version of Llama CPP with GGML support is 0.1.78. With that out of the way, let's move to the terminal and start working on our bot. We will start in our main project directory, and we will continue with the theme of housekeeping first. After wrapping up last video, I left the .env file in the main project directory. As it only contains the Discord API token, it should be in the dbot directory. It worked fine as the .env looks for files in the parent directories, but let's move it to the dbot directory to keep it tidy. We also have a leftover payload.json file that we first used to test our REST connections. We don't need it anymore. We are not going to touch our Llama API directory today, as we don't need to make any changes to the Llama CPP Python. Unless you want to upgrade it to use the GGUF format, then you can activate the virtual environment and run pip install -- upgrade. For now, let's move to the dbot directory. We'll start by activating our virtual environment. And with that active, we will create new files for our configuration management. As the name suggests, the config handler is where we will be saving and loading our config, and the config modal is where we will create our model class for Discord. One last step before we start writing the code is to create a directory for all our channel configs. We will start by scaffolding the config handler first. For the ease of it, we will be creating configs in JSON. Config directory is where we'll be saving and loading the configs from. Configs will contain the dictionary of all of our configs that will be stored in memory, and they will be updated once the file is changed. Default config is where we will specify our default config for any channel that doesn't have the configuration file. For our default settings on any channel, we will go with system prompt as your helpful assistant, max tokens of 256 and max completion tokens for 512. Now let's scaffold out the functions that will actually manage our config. We will have three primary functions: get config file name, which will determine the file name of specific context ID. As you remember, the context ID is basically our channel name. Get config, which will fetch the config for us, and then save config, which will save it or update it in place for the specific content ID, and then we have to pass the whole config. For our file name, we will be creating the path of config directory, which is specified as a global variable, and then string of the context ID and suffix of underscore config JSON. For the get config functions, we want to first try to get the config from the dictionary in memory. If it doesn't exist, then load it, or if the file doesn't exist, then generate it. So let's implement that. So first we are testing if the configs exist. So basically, if we can get the specific context for context ID, then we just return that config from the dictionary. Inclusion of none basically will fail that check. If the config doesn't exist, we were getting the config file name, checking if the file exists. If it does exist, we open it, load the config, update the config in memory, and then return the config. Finally, if the file doesn't exist, we are creating default config for our config, save the file, and then return it. And I just noticed a typo, so let's fix that. So finally, we need to implement the save config function. That should be quite easy. And finally, to save the config, we are first setting it in memory to the config that we're passing to the function. Again, getting the file name and opening the file to write, dumping the JSON string of our config. And that's it. Let's quickly test it out. And so we can see the functions that we have. And here's a tip for you. If you run Python with -i for a specific Python file, it will execute the file, but then it will also drop you into the interpreter so you can do some more manual tests. So now we run all of those functions. So let's try our config equals get config for some made up context. Let's do Yannick. And let's show our config. Cool, so we got the default config. That means that this check actually worked. Let's try to update our config. So now we have a new config dictionary, and let's try to save it and then try to get it again to see if it's correctly read from file. So save config, same context, and we're doing our config. And then let's set our config again to get the same config, and let's check if it exists. Okay, so it does have the correct values. Let's exit the interpreter and actually check if the file exists. Configs. We see that the file was created. We can see the file contents. So it was correctly updated with our settings as well, which is great. So now if we load that again, just to verify, if we do get config, we see that it loads it from file, so it doesn't use the default one. Cool, so that's our config handler ready. That's the most basic config saving and loading. Let's move on to creating the config model. This one will be a bit trickier. It took me longer than I want to admit to figure out how to actually do it. I'm gonna prepare the scaffolding for the class and then we'll discuss it. Okay, before we implement the functions for this class, let's go through what we set up here first. So we are creating class config AI settings, which will be our Discord model. So it's inheriting everything from the model class. On the initialization of this class, which means that basically whenever we call it, we will set the title. So from the super, which means parent class, init function will set the title of our model, which is what will be visible in the top of the window. We specify our context ID, so set it for within the class. This is because we want to be able to call the class for specific channels, so we need to provide the context ID for the config functions to load correctly. We are loading our config for the context, which is we're using the functions that we just created a moment ago within the config handler. And then we have 3 fields that we will use within the model. They are specified over here. And basically on the initialization of the model, we will set the defaults for those fields. So let's look through the fields first and then we go back to it. So we have the max tokens field, which is our text input. The Discord models only support text inputs, so you cannot have any buttons or select fields in there. We create a label for this field, and then the default is set to nothing. We have our complete max tokens field, the same text input, labeling what it does, and then we have our system prompt, also text input, with style of text style long, which means that will give us multi-line text input with the max length of 500 characters, which might be a bit excessive, but if you want to experiment with longer system prompts, that might be useful. The defaults here are always set to empty. This is because on the initialization of the model, so whenever we call it, we want to load our config and populate them with the existing fields. This means that we always get the correct settings that we have set previously for each of the channels. And we can edit them in those fields and then eventually save them. So let's actually implement our function that will allow us to save the config. Now we have 2 functions within our class. First is the onSubmit function, which accepts interaction. This is a Discord interaction that we will implement in our main bot.py file. First, we're getting the old system prompt from our config. This is for a check over here to verify if it's changed, because if it changed, we want to notify the channel that it did. Then we are setting our new config dictionary, specifying all of our fields with the current values of the model. So basically on submission of the model, we're getting the values for each of the fields. So for the max tokens, complete max tokens, and system prompt. We are saving the file with our context handler. So basically we're passing this config. And then we are sending response to the user who updated the config that it was updated using the ephemeral true. Ephemeral true means that only this user will see the notification about the config update. If the LLM system prompt changed, we also want to notify other users in the channel that they will need to reset the context to use the new prompt. So for this, we are using the same interaction channel and we are sending silent message. Silent means that no one in the channel will be pinged for it. It will be visible, but they will not receive the notification. And then eventually on error, in case if there is any error in our class handler, We want to log. So we're using the default Discord Pi logger, which is mentioned in the documentation. We are creating error message. So we basically want to get the type of error, error itself, and then the traceback of the error. We are logging it to the console as well as sending a message to the user with the error message. All of the code for the model is heavily inspired by the example from the Discord Pi. I will link this example in the description as well as the documentation about the logging. This should conclude the class for our model, so now we have to work on actually implementing it. So with the model file ready, let's start editing our bot. We will tidy it up first a bit, so we don't use JSON anymore anywhere in this file. Let's remove that import. And let's move the context handler import higher up. Now, in the bot class, in the client class of the bot, on message, we can improve it a bit by first checking if the message comes from the bot itself. So before we do any of the checks and string modifications, we don't want to do any of that if the bot itself messaged the channel. So let's move that up. I think that's about it from the old code. So now we can work on adding all the new things that we did. So from config model, be wary of the case sensitivity. So we did settings with lowercase, just need to mention it more to myself because I do tend to do a lot of typos. Let's make it alphabetical as well. So from .env, import load.env, and then the next thing we want to do is to actually get our app commands to... For the slash command to work, we need to initialize it during the initialization of the bot class. So let's start by doing this, and we're also gonna add intents as we will need them later on for the model. Right, so now within the init of our class, our bot class, we are setting the intents and allowing the message content for this intents, and then providing the intents to the parent class. Now we're specifying the self tree for the app commands command tree. This is also heavily based on the example for the model. So yeah, if you don't understand any of that, you can look it up on the example listed in the description. Now we want to sync that tree. So basically what sync means is that we want to give the commands to the Discord server on start of the bot. So we will create another function for that. What the setup hook does within the bot client is during the initialization, it will also wait to sync the slash commands. I just noticed something missing here in the command tree. We actually need to provide the self. That should be it for now. So let's actually now create that command. So outside of our class, we need to remove the previously generated intents. Now we're doing it on the class initialization. So don't need that because we just added it here. What we do need is our client tree command. Okay, so this is the most basic implementation of our command to send the model. We will expand it a bit in a moment to add the role check for the security and maybe verify if it's also set within the direct messages. For now, this should be the most basic functioning model. So let's go through it step by step. First of all, it needs to be after we initialize our client. Because we will be specifying the client tree commands. So tree command description is what will be the description provided for this slash command. And this, the function name will be what this slash command will be in the channel itself. So we are passing our interaction as the Discord interaction, getting our context ID as the channel name. So we're getting string of the interaction channel. This is the same formula that we use everywhere else. And then we are waiting, so asynchronous waiting for the response to send modal with our context ID. So the context ID is passed to the model, so it knows which config to load. So let's try it out, see how the bot works with this in mind. Python bot. And perfect, because as always, we have to have some errors. Oh yeah, of course, okay, it took me longer than I want to admit, because we're now specifying intents in the init class, init of the class, we don't need it here, okay. Let's try again, Python bot, starting, it's a good sign. First of all, reset. Okay, chat context reset, and now we should have the /bot config command, and it should bring up the model. So we try that, and unbelievable, it actually worked the first time. So let's try to edit some of it. 1024, 512. You are a boss. Okay, let's save it, and supposedly it did save. Let's verify that by checking the file. Do a new console. Now in configs, we do have the AI test, which is the channel name config. Let's see how it looks like. Smashing, so it saved it. Okay, let's try again. '64, 512. Yeah, just around. Updated. Okay, and it's managing the channel and it's messaging the channel as well. So that's actually a good example here. We already see that the message is being sent. So we're getting the ephemeral message for AI bot config updated, and also the channel getting message that the prompt was updated. So let's try to update it without changing the prompt. Let's do 256 as it was without changing the prompt. And we're only getting the ephemeral message. Great. So now we can save the config, but it's still not going to be used. So we need to modify our LLM handler first. Let's stop the bot here. Let's start implementing our config handler. So we will edit the LLM completions file. This is where we need to add all the config options. We will also add some logging for any potential errors that we might see. So import logging here. And then we also want to import our config handler. I'm going to tidy up something here just for myself. I'm going to be using the REST endpoint on a different machine. So don't worry about that particular part. Now let's go to the completion itself. So for LLM complete, we will now need the context ID as well, because we need to know our configuration for the max tokens. Config. Okay, so that was short and sweet. Basically, we are loading the config for our context ID of the specific channel, and then using the setting of that config for the max tokens. However, this will also require a change to our queue, because previously our queue was not passing the context ID. We will do that in a moment. Let's move on to the chat complete. So for the chat complete, it's pretty straightforward. We're just loading the config for the context ID and then using that max token settings here. However, as you might have noticed, I added all the messages removed variable and also logger. This is because we were going to improve our handling of the context a bit more. So last time we just tried to get the completion, and then for any error we would pop the first message. We're going to make it a bit more robust. We're going to specifically check for what the error that we want that specifies that the context is too long when we want to remove it, and also notify the user that the context was trimmed. So let's implement that now. First, we're going to add the OpenAI error, API connection error. This is specifically when the backend for the Llama CPP API is not working. So we don't need to remove context because the API for the LLM is not reachable. So we log that to the console, and then we also send that message with an exclamation emoji to the user to say that, yes, hey, we couldn't communicate with the LLM. The next error will be more generic. Okay, so now with this more generic handler, we are actually checking specifically for the presence of string. Please reduce the length of the messages for completion. So this is the error that actually indicates that the context is too long for the API to process it. So if that string exists, we are marking that, yes, we want to remove the old messages. If the length of the messages is more than one, then we're popping it. This is just to prevent any other weird errors. Sometimes it might be other error that will then kind of loop all the time and remove all the messages. So that's why we check if there's more messages in the context. If there is more than one messages, we're just removing the first message, and we are carrying on back to the main loop that checks if the tokens were exceeded. Eventually, let's say it pops the message, then it returns it, and it will add the warning to the response that the LLM is giving, that the old context was removed. It's not really an error, it's just a warning. In case if it is an error, so we'll verify here that like if all the context was removed, we are returning the error with the error message. And if the string is not present, that means that it's not error related to the context length. So we just return the error itself without touching the context. It might be something else. Okay, so in the file, we have now implemented the config for max tokens, config for the complete max tokens. And I just had a quick look back at the OpenAI error classes, which can be seen over here. I'm going to link that in the description as well for you to review. What we actually need to modify is to not catch the API error, but catch the OpenAI error. I think that looks good. Okay, so with that in place, we need to modify our request queue to add the context ID to the completions as well. Let's do that now. So that should be relatively simple. Basically, if complete only, we're doing the LLM complete, and we are also passing context ID. Let's remove some extra spaces. That should be that for the context. And let's go back to our bot and implement the security check if the user is allowed to actually change the bot configuration. So the situation where we want to be able to do that is if user is changing it for their DMs, which, like, there is no need to check anything there. For anything else, we want to see if the user has a role that allows them to do that. This way, not like won't allow everyone to change all the channels. In our previously defined bot config /command, we will add all the code to verify it. So I'm going to type it out first and then we'll discuss it. Okay, that should do it. So first we're creating empty list for role names. Then we are checking if the message is a DM. So we're using the same method as we did before in our own message. So basically we're verifying if the channel is instance of the DM channel. So over here, the difference is that we're using the interaction. Then if it is not a DM, we are checking the user role names. So we're using list comprehension. We're getting role name for R for role in the interaction user roles. So we're just creating a list of roles, specifically role names, not role IDs. Then we are verifying if the role AI-bot-config is in role names or if it's a DM. If either of those conditions is met, like before, we are sending user the model to change the configuration. Otherwise, if the user is not in the AI bot config group or if it's not a DM, we're just sending them ephemeral message saying that, hey, you're not allowed to change the config. So let's check how that would look like. Try that again. Bot config. Because I am in the group, I was able to change that. Let's change this. I'm going to remove myself from the group. We have the AI bot config group. You can just create role here. You can call it whatever you want as long as the name matches what's in the code. Specifically in that case, I'm going to manage members, remove myself from that group, and let's try that again. So bot config. And now I'm not getting the modal, instead I'm getting message, you're not in the bot config management group, but I should still be able to modify the config, bot config in the DM. Yep, that is fine. Back to the channel. I'm going to add myself back to the group. Close, and now bot config. And now I'm passing that check because I am in the 6. I'm in the group. That's why I'm getting the model. Cool. Before we wrap it up, we're going to make one more improvement to the bot responses. While using it, I found that there is a very rare occasion where the API request done by the Discord PI to the Discord API exceeds the limit of the API. So that might happen when you have a large context, so large max tokens, and the characters in the response exceed the 2000 limit. So that's actually less than 2000 because the specific request is to 2000, including the headers. So we will add a handler for that. I won't be able to demonstrate it as it happens now, but I do have a screenshot of when that happens, so I'm going to flash that up on the screen. Let's add handler for that now. In the client, within the on message, specifically in the responses where we have the completion, Yeah, so like not the complete, but the chat completion. So we have the complete response. And once we get that response, we want to check its length. So let's implement that now. So now once we get our LLM completion request response, we're checking if it's shorter than 1800 characters. If it is, we respond. If it's not, we will split it. So we are just getting subset of the response up until 1800, and then everything was after 1800. This is specifically set to 1800, even though the limit is 2000, because the limit includes the response headers. We do not have any control over the response headers sent by Discord Pi over here. So we're leaving some headroom. And basically the way it will look afterwards, it will have a split output like visible here. So we have a longer message, and then it will be split into parts. One final nicety that we can add is, since we're adding warning signs, let's have the information source over here, that the context was reset. And the most important part that I almost forgot is we actually need to handle the system prompt in the context handler. So we need to edit our context handler, and now we do not set the system message here. We actually want to load it specifically from the config. So first things first, let's import config handler. Remove the system message, we don't need that anymore. In the load context, we will load our config, and then in the messages where we first created the context, we want to use our specified system prompt. Okay, so I think we have everything now. Let's give it a try, see how it performs. I'm gonna do some example conversation about nonsense just to show the output messages, possible errors and warnings. So let's start by resetting context, setting configuration. We want long responses for chat, and let's come up with something that will actually allow us to test that the system prompt works. Right, that's a bit of a silly system prompt. Like you've seen what I've been typing. We trying to set an evil AI that will take over the world. Let's see how the conversation goes. We definitely can see that it's using the emojis. Just working on taking over the world one step at a time. How about you? Okay. Not very deceiving, but cool. Okay, I just realized that that's gonna take forever because I set the context length of 4096, which is basically for a Llama 2 based model. I'm going to change the context length and try again, do something shorter so we can actually show those warnings. So currently I'm running the Calliope DS model, 13B, Q6, 6-bit quant, and I set the context length to 1024. That should make it much quicker for us to actually reset it, sorry, to get the warnings. Let's change the bot config and start again. Actually, no, before we change the bot config, I just restarted the model. That's a good example, right? So I changed the context length configuration on the server side, on the Llama side. But this context is still stored in the files and it should be quite big. So definitely if we ask another message, we will get an error. So let's see how that goes. So let's, before I send that, let's switch to our bot because we'll see the logger output here. Okay, and this message should have been handled, but something tells me I made a typo. So let's copy the please reduce the length of the messages or completion part, and let's go back to our code. That's in the LLM completions. This is where we should be handling it. So if, there we go. So it should have been or, and I made 4. Totally my mistake. That should be handled now. Let's remove the old one. Please reduce the length of the messages or completion. So now we were checking for that string. And let's try that again. Same message. So immediately before we even get the response from the model, we can see that every context removal was logged to the console with the logger. And then once we got the response, we can actually see the warning added to the reply, alt context removed. Okay, let's see one other error. So let's actually stop the API on the other server and see what happens when we try to query it without the LLM endpoint running. So now we should get an error here. There we go. So error communicating with OpenAPI. The host is not available on that port. Max retries exceeded. And we have the same error over here. So if our endpoint is not running for the Llama CPP or any other API endpoint that we're using in that case, we'll get this nice error. And I think this is where we can end the video today. We added some nice new functionalities, did some cleaning up of the code, better error handling. Let me know if you have any other ideas of what you would like to see done with this bot. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.